couldn't you theoretically, electronically create any sound? Yeah. And that was the thinking of Thaddeus Cahill, inventor and musician around the turn of the 20th century. He had the idea that if you took a giant cog and you rotated it next to an electromagnetic receiver, that you would basically be able to push electrons, wiggle electrons in sine wave shapes. If you think of the shape of a cog, it's got those teeth, right? Well, those teeth are basically sine waves. So every time a tooth would pass near the electromagnetic receiver, it would push the electrons. And then in the gaps between the teeth, it was not a push. So you'd get this pushing movement, which is exactly the wiggle. It's the wiggle. It's that ruler, except it's happening in electrons. So what would happen if you had a cog like this for every note on the piano? You'd be able to create all of the frequencies that we use in music. You'd be able to create electronic tones. And then, what if, for each cog that you had, for each note on the piano, you had a whole slew of other cogs of decreasing size that would generate higher frequencies at lower amplitudes? I know this is the confusing stuff we were talking about, but that's the timbre that we hear. Timbre is just a stack of wiggles, a stack of sine waves in increasing frequency and decreasing amplitude that define what we hear as timbre. So if you had all of these giant rotating cogs and they could all push electrons in sine wave shapes, you'd be able to author sound. That's what Thaddeus Cahill was thinking. So he built this device. And unfortunately, this was before we had amplifiers. So for these things to be audible, they had to be big. You had to move a lot of electrons to be able to move the primitive speaker that he decided he was going to use, which I'll talk about in a second. So these cogs were gigantic. What we're talking about is this instrument that Thaddeus Cahill envisioned, the Telharmonium, was essentially a giant power plant moving giant cogs, which were basically acting as dynamos. This device, the Telharmonium, the principle of it was cogs generated frequencies that could be combined in different manners to create different timbres, differing amplitude, differing frequency. It was all controlled by a keyboard. Now, I mentioned a speaker, but let's remember that speakers really hadn't been invented at this point, except for in one form. There was another invention that was becoming widespread right at that same time, which was the telephone. So it was Thaddeus Cahill's idea that you could electrically generate music and sound, and then electrically disseminate it to telephones. So he had basically created a Muzak service for the telephone. And that was his goal.